Hello, everybody. Can you hear me well? Yes. So I just see that it's now 6:30, and I understand that we are streamed, we are online now. So we're going to talk about the Pegasus Project for 1 hour long. We will take your question, of course, 20 minutes before the end, so we can have a discussion as well. We will show some videos. We will have some fantastic guests with us. Let's start by Danna Ingleton, who is with us from Toronto, I guess. Hi, Danna, how are you doing?
Hello, very good, thank you. Nice to be here virtually with you all.
Perfect. Danna is working for Amnesty Tech. I'm here with Siddharth Varadarajan from The Wire and Sandrine Rigaud from Forbidden Stories. We will talk about the Pegasus Project. You know, that was a Forbidden Stories investigation with 17 news organizations involving 80 partners. We did partnering with reporters to reveal a large scandal of espionage involving a lot of states who were using Pegasus, a spyware called sold by the NSO Group, an Israeli spyware company that is selling that kind of spyware to many state actors. And we were able to reveal the face and the names of a lot of victims all around the world. The victims were based in more than 50 countries. And we will have a chance today to discuss about how we did it, the challenges of this investigation and the impact of this investigation as well, and how this investigation might change or not some things regarding the regulation, because so far there is not a lot of things to protect the citizens. Usually you don't know when you are attacked, you don't see any kind of traces of the spyware. And even if you know that, you don't have a lot to do, because it's difficult to sue the company, it's difficult to sue the state that is always denying using that. But I wanted first to show you a very short video about Pegasus. So that's the trailer that we did release at the beginning of the project. So I'm gonna play a video. Thank you for the tech team to show that. And usually it should come with some sound. Is that okay with you? There is no.
What
Yes.
we have is list of.
Okay.
What we have is list of phone numbers that were targeted, and you are among them.
And what does that program do?
It's transmitting your messages, your images, just everything that's happened on your phone.
Shit.
Your phone was compromised.
They send an attack, steal a bunch of data. The moment they do it, the phone is compromised. They can exfiltrate whatever they want. It's just pretty much automatic.
We have access to a lot of information about a massive surveillance campaign all over the world. That's exclusive materials. It's about who is spying on who in many countries.
Journalist Jamal Khashoggi was killed inside their consulate in Istanbul.
His close friends were surveilled after the murder.
Es la constatación de un espionaje planetario, de un gran crimen mundial. Es una bomba atómica.
So we released this project. I will stop this video as well here. We released that on, and can we stop playing that? Thank you. On the 18th of last July, can each of you tell me what you like the most in this project, or what made this project very different from others? Let's start with you, Sandrine.
If you put aside the... Sorry, the mic is on.
Of course, if you put aside the scale of that story, the scoop it represented, and which we were quite aware of when we got access to that leak with the Amnesty International Security Lab, presented by Danna here. The biggest challenge was clearly how to communicate and how to make possible an international collaboration on a story about spyware. So that was the first challenge, and it's very complicated to start an investigation asking all the partners to stop using their phones, their computer, to put their phones in another room. I mean, it's something that you sometimes forget, and it's clearly the biggest challenge we had to deal with. Thanks to AI Security Lab, we were able to conceive a whole new system of communication, but getting the first contact was very difficult. And I remember that when we had to reach out to Siddharth, when we started that story, we had to go through a journalist we already knew, whom we were able to brief in a very secure way, and that did hundreds of kilometers to meet Siddharth and his team in Delhi. So that was a huge challenge in terms of operational conduct of the investigation.
And Danna, what made this project different from the other ones?
Yeah, thank you. I mean, as Sandrine said, I mean, if we are setting aside the scale and the scope, which in and of itself made the Pegasus Project really a career of a lifetime for anybody working in human rights work. I think the thing that most obviously made this project different and ultimately a huge success was partnering with the many journalists around the world and bringing together the expertise that Amnesty International has been developing for a number of years on forensic research capabilities. And I'll speak about this a little bit later in the panel, but building on the traditional research methodologies that we use and are known for to become fit for purpose to provide the kind of technical support we did to the consortium, both in terms of secure communications, but also documenting what is meant to be undocumentable invasions of our privacy through software. So I think the thing that made this project really different and unique for me was being able to partner with investigative journalists around the world and being able to bring the technical expertise that we've been working so hard for the last number of years to be able to contribute the technical evidence that we did, and then to obviously see the massive impacts coming off the back of it. I mean, Laurent mentioned at the beginning that this is really leading to changes in regulation, and to be able to work on a project that so significantly changes the context of a human rights issue that you're working on is an incredible experience, and also to be able to to contribute to creating a safer environment for journalists and human rights defenders around the world. I think, a number of us had been beating the drum for a very long time that this was a massive issue for privacy, for human rights defenders, for journalists, for everybody. And I think the Pegasus Project brought irrefutable evidence that that's the case, and things need to change.
And Siddharth, you based in a country where the spyware was massively used against journalists or civil society. What made this project different from the other ones?
Well, I think the scale of the project, the collaboration, the fact that we were working along with more than a dozen other media organizations in a truly collaborative project, but doing so, and you can imagine the logistical difficulties of this, and you know very well, but the audience. How do you deal with and communicate on a virtually real-time basis with a team of 60 or 70 reporters across the world, most of whom you don't know personally and you've never met? And when the subject material that you're dealing with is not only highly explosive and confidential, but had to be handled in a way that was completely secure. In India, we had the additional problem, which is that unlike, say, some of our other media partners who were looking at the use of Pegasus by country A against a target in country B. That target may have been in their country. We know, for example, the French president and various French ministers. But in our case, the targets were in India, and the people who had deployed Pegasus were the Indian government, as far as we were concerned. So this added an additional layer of menace, if you will, because not only are you keeping something confidential because of the nature of the data, but you are trying to do this difficult journalistic legwork of validating the information, contacting people on the list, trying to persuade them to agree to forensics of their phone, and in an environment where we knew personally that our phones had been targeted. So I am one of the two journalists at The Wire whose phones were conclusively identified as being infected with Pegasus. And there were other journalists too who were on the list, but whose phones we couldn't find traces of.
Because this is a thing we should mention and talk a little bit more. So at the beginning, we were willing to build the best dream team around the world, having investigative reporters to investigate that leak, to identify people behind the phone numbers. And to build that dream team, we were looking for partners like Siddharth at The Wire. And then we saw the phone numbers of Siddharth on the list itself. So that was quite tricky to work with good investigators, because they are so good, they are on the list as well. And we knew that the danger can come from that way. Like, we didn't want to be the next one on the list or to endanger the entire project, our sources. So what is it how did you feel when you discovered that you were on the list, that when we did your forensic investigation of your own device, we found some traces of the spyware? How did you feel?
It was obviously upsetting, as you can imagine. Pegasus, given the capabilities that it has, is a brutal intrusion of an individual's privacy. So there is that element of personal violation that anybody whose phone is targeted would naturally feel. In our case, this was compounded by the fact that we're reporters, right? So as reporters, as journalists, your mind immediately goes to who the people you were in touch with, what were the stories that you were working on personally that had required, protection of sources. And then you wonder, did anybody's safety get compromised because of this? So it wasn't so much worry about one's own liability so much, or one's own, of course the violations are upsetting, but you then wonder, okay, you hope to heaven that nobody's identity might have been compromised. So there was that level of a sense of violation. But it became clear to us that this is, above all, an assault on freedom of the press. Because when you represent, when you use Pegasus, or when you deploy spyware against journalists, you are clearly intending to hamper the work that they do. Every journalist worth her or his salt assumes, especially if you live in a country like India, or even if you don't, it's safe to assume that, given the kind of work we do, you will be under watch. And many of us over the years had taken to basic precautions, like having sensitive calls through encrypted voice apps like WhatsApp or Signal or Telegram. We had all stopped pretty much using SMS. We would only send WhatsApp or Signal messages. And the assumption was that the capability of lawful interception that the Indian state has would be confined to the normal telecom interception methods. So discovering that encrypted messaging has also been compromised, right? So this is a clear attack, a qualitative escalation of.
You were surprised?
Frankly, yes. I mean, because one had assumed. I mean, we used to consciously, whenever we were discussing something that we felt was a little bit sensitive as a story, we would consciously hang up the phone and call each other back on Signal or WhatsApp on the assumption that this was okay, until we realized that our phones had been targeted with Pegasus. So this is an attack on media freedom, and we were very clear about this. And when you invited us to be part of this project, we readily agreed, because having dealt with a variety of intrusions on media freedom in India, and then encountering what represents clearly a massive escalation, we felt it was important to investigate this, to report it as professionally as possible. And I think the strong point, apart from the leaked database, but the strong point that the project's methodology brought to the table, thanks to AI's lab, was that we didn't treat the presence of a number on the list as proof by itself, right? We said, okay, let's try to understand if these phones were actually infected, and then devising methods to test these phones. So even though there was an element of the personal, having been targeted myself, and my colleagues having been targeted, my co-editor M.K. Venu, his phone was also, in fact, his phone showed Pegasus activity pretty much on the date that we were testing it. So there was an element of the personal, but it was important to research the story and investigate it with all the tools of tradecraft that we had at our disposal. And there, the Amnesty International, AI's technical teams, forensics, which were an integral part of the way you designed the project, made it a very, very robust exercise. And I think at the end, by showing the presence of Pegasus on not only our phones, but the phones of other journalists, the phones of opposition politicians, we were also able to underline the fact that the use of Pegasus is not just a violation of individual privacy, it's not just an assault on media freedom, but it undermines the very foundation of democracy. Because when you use Pegasus against opposition politicians, say, or people on the independent election commission, or when you target human rights defenders, you target lawyers, but most importantly, opposition leaders in the middle of an election, and you use clearly spyware purchased by a government, paid for by the taxpayers' money. This is a grievous assault on the integrity of electoral democracy. And it was important to highlight that.
And see that you were not the only one journalist targeted by Pegasus who were amongst the partners. And so, Sandrine, you were coordinating this large effort. Can you tell us more about the other journalists who were part of the project who were as well targeted, but and also in a way how having those journalists targeted amongst the group was also a way for the investigation to move quite quickly, right?
Yeah, it's a question we had. I mean, from the beginning, we knew that investigating the use of a spyware by countries that are not examples of democracy would be quite dangerous, and that one of us might have been might be targeted himself. But then you decide to contact people who are clearly already targets, which was the case of Siddharth, of MK Venue, the co-founder of The Wire, but also of journalist in Hungary from Direct 36, Szabolcs Spani. So this is a risk you take, but we ask ourselves the question, but we answered it very quickly, because basically it was the safest way to do the first forensics. We needed to have confirmation of what we were seeing on the list, and for that we needed to contact people we were trusting, and our colleagues were the people we trusted the more, and the one who accepted to do that in secrecy, to do the forensics of their phone. And this is what gave us the first confirmation of the infections. And one of the advantages is that those targets are really aware of the risk they're taking using their phone. So for that, for them, the threat is not only theoretical, it's very concrete. So they are the one who respect the most seriously all the protocol. And the last reason is that they are the one who are really at the heart of the investigation. So we move much quicker when we involve people from, Siddharth or Shabox, who are really capable to contact their own sources in the country, and the investigation moved much quicker when they were involved. In some cases, though, we decided not to contact or involve journalists in countries that was using Pegasus, and journalists who were targeted themselves when we thought it was too dangerous for them. In Morocco, we knew a lot of journalists who had been targeted in Azerbaijan as well, but we assessed the risk, and we thought it was a bigger risk to take.
Thanks, Sandrine. And a question for you, Danna. So, as you all understand, one key thing for this project and for us was to get some evidences, and that was the very first time, I think, in the history of the investigation against cyber surveillance that we were able to prove some attacks and to have access to such a list of victims. And this is thanks to the work of Amnesty International. We were able to build a technology, a tool, able to find some traces of the spyware activity on your device. And Danna, can you tell us more about how long did it take to build that tool for your team? I'm thinking about Claudio Carnieri and Donka Archibald, and sorry if I'm misspelling the name of Donka, it's always difficult. But can you tell us more about what it takes to arrive at this result of that such innovative tool?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. And actually, I think, to be able to answer that question, I think it's helpful to take a little bit of a step back and think about sort of the journey that human rights organizations and organizations like Amnesty have to go through to be able to provide that kind of technical assistance. And I guess before taking that step back up, just to say that when we're involved in this project, we had a few sort of primary objectives, and one of them was making sure that we were able to communicate safely. I think the rest of the panelists have made it really clear that you're in a really tricky situation when, also because of the global pandemic and restrictions on travel, you need to contact people on devices that are or could have been compromised. So really wanting to make sure that we were being as thoughtful as possible about the risks and threats that we know and about how Pegasus itself works. And also to try and make what is a really complicated forensic methodology as sort of user-friendly for our journalist partners, because they're the ones sitting with the potential targets, asking them to take backups of their phones, spending the time to be there with them. So we had, one of our major prerogatives was trying to make that process as sort of user-friendly, if you will, as possible. Also, of course, taking into consider, all the major issues with data security, and making sure that we were only, looking at the places in the phone where we needed to get the evidence. And then, of course, how to document that evidence and explain it in a way that it could be used as just that, evidence. I mean, this is stuff that is a very new methodology. So being very authoritative in our findings and being really clear about what we found so that it could be reported accurately was a major prerogative for us. So having sort of laid those out, going back, technology and human rights is somewhat surprisingly still a pretty new field. It's really only been within the last 10, maybe 15 years that human rights organizations have started looking at and embedding technology and human rights in their work. And I think looking at the evolution of how that started is the story of how we landed on being able to develop these tools. At least from my personal experience, the evolution really started with civil society working with human rights defenders and journalists on digital security practices, recognizing that there are threats out there and there are things you can do to protect yourself. And then it sort of evolved to interrogating how we ourselves were using these tools and trying not to cause any harm. And the next natural sort of evolution, and particularly with Amnesty, was looking at, well, if we know these harms are, these harms and risks exist, and we know that there are these adversaries that are trying to get into the devices of human rights defenders and journalists around the world, we need to develop the means to actually prove how those risks are coming about. What is the technology behind it? How is it being implemented? How is it really affecting the phones? And of course, we weren't working alone. There's a large community of security investigators working on these kinds of things. But when it comes to international human rights organizations, Amnesty was really an early adopter, exploring and embedding how to do innovative forensic investigations into our work. And as I alluded to in my previous comments, really building on a very robust traditional human rights research methodology to include technology and forensic investigations. And to do that, we created the Security Lab, which was the partner in this investigation. And we would not have been as sort of fit for purpose as we were for the Pegasus Project had we not already been doing a number of years of investigations, trying out different techniques, trying to understand where the mistakes that spyware companies are making in their code to basically be able to show that actually we can detect the undetectable. We've done, in addition to a number of other reports in 2018, we exposed the targeting and attacks of a prominent women human rights defender in Pakistan that really started to show how it's possible to bring together traditional research methods and forensic work. And before Pegasus Project itself, we also did a number of reports looking at Pegasus and NSO groups work, including the targeting of one of my own colleagues at Amnesty International. And it was through these projects and developing both the methodology and our own sort of systems around it that we were able to develop, the ability to find traces. That said, the Pegasus Project created its own challenges, having to do this remotely, having to do it through working with journalists who, a lot of people have a very different sort of understanding of technology and how it works, and then of course how to document it. So it's sort of a larger contextual background that I've given you there, but I think it's a really an important one, and it's an important one for Amnesty International and me personally to show that if we are looking ahead to the future and want to stay at the sharp end of where the threats are, we're able to develop these kinds of technologies. And of course, it is with the brilliant minds of our technologists, Claudio and Donica, to name a few, but there are certainly others who are just sitting behind the computer at all times, trying to figure out how to expose these things to be able to work safely with journalists, with human rights defenders, and to continuously understand what the risks are so that people can also understand how to work more safely.
Danna. And a lot of forensic have been done in India. So let's go back to India for a second. I saw many news articles talking about the Watergate, like the Pegasus Project revelation were considered as an Indian Watergate. Siddharth, when you first accessed the list of the Indian targets, what was your initial reaction, your initial feeling, your fear? Many political opponents targeted by the Modi authorities. What kind of danger you were facing at that time? What kind of security measures you take? And what was your process about working about something that you cannot really talk too much about? How to approach the victims or how to investigate this?
Yeah. So just to inform the audience, the single biggest name in the political sphere to come out when we examined the list was Rahul Gandhi, who at the time that he was targeted was the president of the Congress party, and had been, his number or numbers that he was using are numbers that not just him, so there was his name, of course, his numbers, but also people working closely with him in his office, and even more kind of sort of sinister, if you like, there were the numbers of 5 or 6 of his social acquaintances or friends who are actually not political people and have nothing to do with politics. But what that was indicative of, and we saw this in a few other instances as well, that in order to be comprehensive in their targeting, whoever chose or selected somebody like Rahul Gandhi as a person of interest was playing safe and ensuring that in case he had access to other phones, then you cover those phones too. In case he's spending time or hanging out or conversing with friends, or maybe he may use a friend's phone, so you target those phones. And we saw this as a recurring pattern. In the case of one guy who actually, and frankly, we've not been able to understand or figure out. In the case of Rahul Gandhi, yeah, He was the opposition leader. You were going into an election. So there's a lot, I mean, it's illegal completely. And this is, I want to underline that this is much worse than Watergate, right? Because Nixon, I don't believe, was accused of using government money to break into the Watergate building, or he wasn't accused of using employees of the US government to do that. Whereas in this case, Pegasus is officially bought by an Indian government agency, although they won't admit it. But Israel says we only sell to governments, and would have been paid for by the taxpayer, and would have been deployed, given its sensitive nature, by a government agency. So
and secretly.
So it's much worse than Watergate. But one of the targets was a gentleman who was a minister in Modi's government, and we don't fully understand why this unfortunate gentleman, attracted this kind of interest. But we found something like 14 numbers. So there was the minister, his wife, his secretary, his media advisor, his cook, his gardener, his driver.
Surrounded.
It was crazy. It was crazy. And not just in Delhi, where he was officially, a minister, but also in his hometown in Madhya Pradesh. So it was as if they were really, really, really interested in this guy for whatever reason. And
do you have any idea why?
Because he was. You have factions within the ruling party, but to the best of our knowledge, he was not an opponent of Modi. So we don't understand. But your question of how do you deal with how do you report on this without revealing, after all. So we took the sensible approach, which is that if there was anybody on the database who was likely to go running to government, we kept them till the very end as a basic precaution. So Rahul Gandhi, we were fairly confident would not squeal, would not go running, and he was informed fairly early on in the project, but through physical meetings that I had, because we didn't want to risk any other form of communication. And that itself presented challenges because we had to meet at the very height of the second wave of COVID in India. So it was difficult and challenging, but he cooperated and he understood. He understood the importance of confidentiality, and the fact that we needed time to work this, and that we were not going to rush into print simply on the basis of numbers being on a database, but we would approach it in a kind of methodical way. But the ministers, we contacted them much later, and they were totally flabbergasted. There was not just the gentleman I mentioned, but there was another minister who ironically became the Minister for Information Technology.
Wow.
Whose job it became, the unfortunate job it became when the expose was published on the 18th, he was the chap they had to field in Parliament to deny the whole thing. But of course, he was careful not to deny, because if you deny in Parliament, then it's contempt of Parliament if you're proved wrong. So he said everything under the sun except the crucial words: we have not used Pegasus. Even to date, it's been a year now, neither in Parliament nor to the Supreme Court has the government of India ever been willing to say categorically that we have used Pegasus or we have not used Pegasus. They simply say, well, everything we do is lawful, and we are a responsible government. They would make these kinds of statements, but they would not answer the crucial question. But I think that all the caution that we employed, and the fact that we approached in a systematic way, and also the fact that we had very good partners. I mean, I want to acknowledge. I mean, the Washington Post and Guardian, Le Monde correspondents who were either in India or who had dealt with India. We worked seamlessly like a team, and we were able to, if there was somebody that we had a particularly tricky relationship with, it was much easier to have the Washington Post reporter speak to them. And that's how we finally worked the story. And, I don't think it was until we finally wrote to the government 2 days or 3 days before that they that they realized or knew what was happening.
And since we talk about governments, Sandrine, can you tell us more about the profile of the customers of NSO, the profile of the targets as well? I think we were investigating we were having 11 states within the list. Some of them have excellent reputation in terms of human rights, like Saudi Arabia, like Azerbaijan, Morocco. So countries who are ready to do a lot of things against journalists. Can you tell us more about the profile of the victims? It was not only about journalists, right?
Yeah. We had an idea before the Pegasus Project of the misuse, the kind of misuse that was possible with NSO. There were reports published by Amnesty International or Citizen Lab, and victims known in Mexico, for example, Carmen Aristegui, who was a journalist who was part of the project as well, was a known victim. We had even activists, again, for soda tax in Mexico, so nothing to do with the journalist or human rights activists, but still unlawful targeting. Citizen Lab had reported about Omar Abdulaziz, who was Jamal Khashoggi's friend, so we knew that at least the promises and what NSO was explaining publicly, that this tool was solely used to target and fight terrorism or pedophiles or crime organization, that was not totally true. But we had this very strong confirmation once we got the list. One of the methods we used to see who was on the list was cross-checking our phone contacts and our phone books with the list. So this is what Laurent and I did when we got that list. And the first numbers that were appearing were numbers of colleagues of ours. So I had the number of Jorge Carrasco from Proceso, who was a partner of one of our project on the cartels. We had the number of Mexican journalists like Marcela Turati appearing. Laurent was in contact with Khadija Ismailova in Azerbaijan, and he immediately saw her number appearing on the list. So we knew from the beginning that, we would have a lot of journalists. And at the time of the publication, we went up to more than 180 journalists on the list. And those were only the numbers who could have been fact-checked before publication. But we also have identified dozens of human rights activists, of doctors, of lawyers. Siddharth told you about politicians. All those kinds of profile that neither the company nor the governments are recognizing. So that was a confirmation at a scale we have never been able to prove before.
Thank you. And I would like to show you another video that's about the impact of the project, or when people, including MEPs from the European Parliament, were asking for more regulation, because this is a fact. There is nothing to protect the citizens so far. So many things have to be done. So if I can share and play, yes, thank you, that's perfect.
This is my phone. I take it everywhere, apparently. But now imagine your biggest enemy sits in this phone.
The Pegasus Project kick-started a conversation and sparked a realization that surveillance can reach parts of their lives that they thought were never imaginable.
The Israeli government is allowing the selling of these technologies without limitation, without consideration of human rights issues.
This is peeling back a curtain that we have never seen done before, this level of granularity.
The Pegasus Project really personalized our understanding of surveillance, because we were able to put faces to the victims of this stuff. Civil society activists, lawyers, journalists, politicians, people trying to do good things are being scuppered and have a lot to fear as a result of these technologies.
There hasn't been a bigger story to rock the political ship of the government like this in several years.
L'absence de réaction a été terrifiante par nos dirigeants. Le président de la République française, lui-même surveillé, des personnalités publiques en Allemagne, en Espagne, en Belgique, un gouvernement directement impliqué, celui de la Hongrie. Quel silence! Et pourquoi?
We certainly don't want the government to know in advance what kind of stories we are working on, who are the people we're speaking to, what kind of documents or information do we have access to. You're basically violating the ability or the right of a journalist to do her work.
The Israeli government is the one that given the export license. NSO is not moving a millimeter without the approval of the Israeli government.
Jól értem, a Pegasus szoftver beszerzője a belügyminisztérium?
A igen. De nem láttok semmi kivetnivalót.
Pegasus est une arme. Ces logiciels sont des armes extrêmement puissantes qui peuvent ébranler des États, qui peuvent faire s'affaisser des sociétés, qui peuvent faire s'affaisser des démocraties. Et donc, il faut impérativement réglementer leur utilisation.
Thank you. And this is a question for you, Danna, since we're talking about regulation. With Amnesty, you are doing a lot of work to fight for better regulation, to protect the citizens. You are even with Amnesty suing NSO as well. What is for you where are we now with this effort of getting a better regulation, and what is for you the best way to protect the citizen? Is that a call for a ban of all those spyware?
Thank you. It's a very big and very exciting, pardon me, question. So just for clarity for those in the room, I mentioned in one of my earlier interventions that one of my colleagues at Amnesty International had been targeted with Pegasus in 2018. And that's the case that Laurent is referring to. We brought a case in Israel against the Ministry of Defense for issuing the export license to NSO Group. That was the export license that was in use to export the Pegasus, which was used to target my colleague. So I think that the question of regulation is a huge one. We support, obviously, the UN calls for a global moratorium on the use, transfer, and sale of surveillance technologies until human rights compliant regulatory systems can be in place. Now, of course, this is a global problem and regulation needs to happen at many levels. That video, excellently started to articulate all the things that have been happening since the launch of the Pegasus Project. So we see at a number of national levels, these investigations kicking off. There's a number of criminal investigations going on in others. The goal, of course, being to understand how in different countries this work can be regulated, and that regulation can happen at many different levels. On the one hand, we need to make sure that that authorities are implementing the use of these kinds of technologies, which the Pegasus Project has clearly explained are highly nefarious and have massive implications for privacy. So we need to make sure that authorities and governments are using in line with like legal principles and in law, and that it's used in proportion that it's needed for. So as has already been mentioned by somebody else on the panel, NSO claims to sell this to governments to fight crime and terrorism and abuse of children online. But what we have now is irrefutable evidence is being used to suppress other voices, human rights defenders, journalists, etc. So clearly it's also not proportional. So at one level, regulation needs to happen at the national level. Also at regional levels, the discussions at the EU have been particularly helpful. I think there needs to be more discussions about what regional bodies like the EU and others can do to ensure that the export regulation, the export and import of these technologies is done in a human rights compliant way. And of course, also making sure that companies who are supplying governments with this kinds of technologies are in fact abiding by the United Nations guiding principles on human rights, doing human rights due diligence impact assessments, ensuring that investors around the world, ensuring that they're holding the companies to account to make sure that they're also compliant with international human rights law standards. And then of course at the global scale. So I think a moratorium is absolutely needed because we've shown the extent of the risks that we're facing. And then that regulation needs to follow. And these investigations that are happening right now are going to allow us to better understand where the systems are broken, because there's no doubt that they are broken. The surveillance industry has been long described as the Wild West, and it's because there's such a state corporate nexus at play that there hasn't to date been a lot of reason for states to want to regulate this, but I think that we've given them the evidence that they certainly do need to, and supporting the regulation. And obviously also at Amnesty International, supporting as many legal cases around the world going forward. We supported the one being brought in Israel against the Ministry of Defense, but we're also ensuring that all of the technical evidence that we've been collecting through Pegasus Project and since, I think that's the other thing that we haven't really touched on yet in this conversation, is that we were able to expose a huge scandal in July last year, but the stories have kept coming. We're still getting more and more evidence, and at Amnesty, we're documenting and providing evidence as we can to people bringing cases that will then hopefully spark more domestic regulation of these issues.
Thank you, Danna. We are running a bit late. It's 21, so we can take some question, of course. And I understand that there is no mic, but you can say your question. I will repeat the question through the mic so people who are watching the stream can understand what was the question. First question. If there is a first question, yes. So the question asked here is about the reaction of the companies about this revelation and how did they react, how did they act. Maybe we let Sandrine answering this, right?
Yeah, we had an important reaction from Apple because the project revealed that NSO was using many vulnerabilities actually in iOS systems, and Claudio and Donka at Amnesty Labs were able to prove how the spyware was going through iMusic or iPhotos or iMessage. So after those revelations, Apple decided to sue NSO and also to notify the victims. And that was quite an important step because we discovered new victims in countries we didn't report on.
Thank you, Sandrine. Any other question on any other aspects of the investigation or the project or the topic, the cyber surveillance? Please feel free to ask.
While you're waiting for someone to ask a question,
Yes, please, Danna.
Do you mind if I just jump in with something else on the big tech companies?
Yes, please.
Sorry, I just wanted to add. Yeah, okay. Sorry, there's a bit of a feedback. I just wanted to add that I think that the importance of Apple responding in the way they did can't be underestimated. You know, these technologies often involve the abuse of these tech platforms. I mean, either whether we're looking at basic phishing attacks through to more sophisticated zero-day attacks, or using iMessage, et cetera, that we found in this. And I think that this has been I think a pretty seismic shift in ensuring that these big tech companies are responding to these issues and do take sort of responsibility for the safety of their users. So I just wanted to interject that I think that the Pegasus Project has been an incredibly important aspect for that. And I think that there's still a lot more to explore in terms of the involvement, reaction, and involvement of big tech companies in these kinds of surveillance operations.
Yes, we have one question here, another question just right after. Yes, what is your question?
And about the Apple issue, was this bug affecting Android as well, and did Google say anything at all?
So the question is here about were there any infection of Android device, and what was the reaction of the company behind Android? So I think, Danna, you can answer this, right?
So one of the tricky things about this kind of investigation is, as I've said a few times already, I mean, we're trying to unearth things that are meant to be secret. So even though we were able to find infections on more iPhones and through the Apple platform, it doesn't mean that it's not possible on Android devices. But the way that we were able to basically, do the investigations, it was easier for us to identify on Apple devices. And we're still continuing to develop our research methodologies so that we can in fact try and find similar amounts of infections on Android devices. But the platforms are sort of different enough, and the tech, we're still working on developing those technologies. So just because we haven't found many on Androids, it certainly doesn't mean that they're not there. It just means we haven't been able to find them yet.
Thank you, Danna. Another question, in blue. About Pegasus. So the question here is do we have a full understanding of the entire process of the Pegasus attack, or are we expecting some other developments or other news regarding Pegasus? I think I just can start maybe answering. So thanks to the work of Danna, Claudio, and Donka from AI Security Lab, we something that need to be mentioned, Amnesty take a very important decision at the end of the project by releasing all the knowledge they do have about the Pegasus attack and the process of the attack. They were releasing publicly the process names, the names of any files who were involved in that process, so to make sure that all the public opinion will have access to that kind of knowledge about Pegasus, and so citizens might be better protected. And in addition to that, Amnesty did release as well a tool available and free for any kind of citizens to investigate your own device and to see if there was some attack. And by that way, many other people around the world were discovering that there were some victims. But Danna, can you answer this question about, do you expect at Amnesty International Security Lab or Tech some new information about the attack, the process of a Pegasus attack, or do you think the company is almost down now?
I think there's two parts to that question. I mean, one is the threats and the ways that they're attacking and how the system works is always going to be evolving. I mean, some of our top technologists have always, talked about this as a giant game of whack-a-mole. Even in the last 5 years, we've seen the progression from, early versions of Pegasus, where you, as the potential target, had to click on a link that would then take you, to a URL that would infect your phone, and then move on without your knowledge, through to, Amnesty International. We were able to expose that Pegasus was using something known as a man-on-the-side attack, meaning it was actually infecting a network that you would then use, and then it could sort of install itself and uninstall itself. And then the development of the WhatsApp story, where they were exploiting zero-day vulnerabilities to use WhatsApp without its knowledge to infect. So I think, these things are always going to be evolving. I think Pegasus is always going to be evolving. Obviously, NSO Group and Pegasus is in a lot of trouble right now, and we'll see what happens with that, and we'll continue to track it. And as Laurent rightly said, I mean, really committed to publishing any kind of information that we have, and publishing it in a very timely basis, so that other security researchers can build on it, contribute to the community of practice. But I think that also then brings us to the bigger question of, Pegasus, NSO Group and Pegasus is an example of what can happen when this surveillance industry is unregulated, and also seeing where if NSO were to close, where would these technologies pop up elsewhere? What other systems are at play? So I think we're going to continue to see the evolution, and it's always going to be a bit of a game of cat and mouse. And at Amnesty, we're committed to continuing to try and expose it and understand it. And I think this is one of the big things for us that's actually been really key. In order to provide security to civil society, to journalists, in order to understand what digital security is needed, we have to understand the threats. So we're kind of constantly chasing what those threats are, so that information can be turned back into practices, both for protecting yourself through digital security, but also the evidence needed to regulate. So it's a big sort of complicated question, but I think we're always going to be seeing the evolution, and we need to all stay committed to continuously, exploring and reporting on those evolutions, so that this industry and the companies that support it don't sort of go back underground to violate privacy rights at will.
Thank you, Danna. Other questions? Yep. So your question is about how did we expect to see at some point during the investigation to observe other attacks from other spyware? Or how did you make sure that Pegasus and other spywares weren't picking up on your reporting methods as you were investigating this? Yeah, this is for you, Sandrine.
Basically, we started working with the assumption that one of us was going to be targeted either by Pegasus or another spyware. Some partners were already targeting, and until the end of the investigation period. So basically, we created a whole parallel communication system. But I mean, we cannot work on that taking no risks at all, because at some point you need to get in touch with people who are not equipped the way you are. So this is why we decided to keep the investigation period very short, because the more we were investigating, the more risks we were taking. We could have worked on that list for years, to be honest. But at some point, we decided that for security reasons, we had to make it very, very short.
When we say very short, it's 6 months or... yes, one last question, maybe. Yes, please.
inform us about these practices. You said with Pegasus, if I get it right, it was kind of found by incident in some way in 2016. There was no whistleblower involved. And I was wondering if since then, coming perhaps from NSO, you had perhaps some information kind of emerging from inside the company, from somebody working there, leading to kind of help understanding how the software was created and how it was then used and sold outside.
It's true that...
You'll have to repeat the question for the...
sorry, you're right. I was forgetting that. So the question is about, with the Snowden revelation, everything started with a whistleblower. Edward Snowden, who was revealing to the entire world how the NSA was using PRISM, a program done by and built by the NSA to spy on everybody on the planet. And your question was about, do you have more and more sources coming from that cyber industry sector coming to journalists to provide you information? So I can start with one small answer. Of course, that's a community, the cyber industry. Most of those people are coming from the military first. Most of the human resources of the NSO group is coming from the unit A200, which is a cyber unit of the Israel Defense Forces. So it's not that easy to have some relationship with people coming from that, working for that industry. And of course, many of those kind of information of businesses are very classified as well. Many governments are using some similar technology to weaponize their adversary. So it's clearly not an easy sector to find sources. In the meantime, the threats against democracies are more and more concerning, dangerous. We see with the Pegasus Project, the profile of the list, we see that most of the people who are in that list, all of them are representing danger for some powers. So there are some more and more people who are talking to us because they want something to change and to happen, and many things have to be done because it looks like the market of the traditional weapon 40 or 50 years ago, where there were no regulation at all, no transparency at all. There is not a lot of transparency yet on that kind of market and businesses, but clearly so far there is nothing to protect the citizens. I don't know if you want to add something on this question.
Not on that directly, but I do want to say that it's incumbent on journalists, given what we know, that we use best practices for communication, and that when we're working on sensitive stories, not just this one, any sensitive story, given the environment that you're in, it's important to follow sensible protocols. But what you can't allow is the fear of surveillance to paralyze your work as a journalist. I think that's, I mean, I want to emphasize this for reporters who are listening, or younger reporters who are wondering, is it safe to do stuff? It's possible that you get paralyzed and say, well, this is an impossible story to do, and you sort of retreat into a shell. You can't do that. So it's important to have situational awareness, but you can't stop your work as a journalist. So you have to speak to people on the phone, you have to meet people, but you follow precautions. And you be sensible, but you can't stop. And the worst thing would be if the idea of Pegasus, even after Pegasus has been exposed, exerts a kind of chilling effect on the work that journalists do. I think that's important to keep that in mind.
Thank you so much, Siddharth. And I think we are, it's 7:35, so it's now time to say thank you to you. Thanks for all your questions, for your interest, for your support. Thanks, Danna from Toronto. That was wonderful to have you. Thanks, Sandrine and Siddharth. Thank you all. Enjoy the Perugia.